Part 15. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn. I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 154. Shen Yu was covered with frost and dew all the way, and she was riding fast, but she couldn't catch up with Xieting Zhou. In time, she finally arrived at the palace. The door of Qingpu residence was closed tightly, and the guards were guarding the entrance. It was obvious that Xieting Zhou had returned. Shen Yu was about to go in, but the guard moved to the side and blocked the door. Chang Liu sat on the eaves, folded his arms and said, "Your Highness has been traveling all night and just fell asleep. You can come back later." Shen Yu thought about it. It would be better to go to the Ministry of War to get a job and then come back to him. Chang Liu looked at her leaving back and couldn't help but muttered, "The person I provoked doesn't know how to coax him and leave as soon as he wants, so why don't he be thick-skinned and stalk him?" Shen Yu went to the Ministry of War, and the people in the Ministry of War all acted based on Shangshu Wen Hongyuan's expression. Wen Hongyuan's nephew Wen Leshan had just committed murder. If he lost his job, he might not even be able to save his life. Now that someone with a high-level position has come, the people from the Ministry of War will naturally go to great lengths to make things difficult for him. It was already evening when we returned, and Qingpu House was still the same as it was in the morning. The guard stopped him again. "Your Highness, please rest." Shen Yu glanced at the sky. It was not dark yet, so resting was just an excuse. There was no need to rest all day. Shen Yu discussed with Conway, "It's convenient for us to work together for such a long time." The guard looked around to make sure there was no one on the eaves, and lowered his voice to remind, "His Highness will close the door when he comes in the morning and see no one. Maybe if you come tomorrow morning, his anger will be gone." There was nothing he could do. There was an order in the yard that no one could disturb him. Now the Kono all know that Shijir is born as a girl, and the relationship with His Highness is naturally different. However, no one in this order clearly points to Shijir, and no one dares to take Xieting Zhou's order seriously. Shen Yu can't wait until tomorrow morning. Today, I received an order from the Ministry of War to suppress the bandits sooner rather than later. The troops had been ordered before Wen Leshan's accident, and she was asked to set off early tomorrow morning. Shen Yu thought for a while, "Then I won't embarrass you." After saying that, she stumbled into the courtyard. Kono didn't expect that she would force her way in, and before he could stop her, he heard the sound of fighting in the courtyard. The secret guards were flying over, and they wanted to stop them, but they didn't dare to draw their swords, so they could only greet them with their bare hands. Shen Yu's punch was so powerful that the secret guard felt a strong wind coming from it. The secret guard was surprised when their arms collided. He had never fought against Shijir, but he had seen her use the sword that night. She was flexible and elegant, but he did not expect that she, a woman, could be so fierce in her boxing skills. The secret guard slid his foot in an arc. "We don't need to take action, right?" "Then don't stop me." Shen Yu's second move came one after another. One kick in the air missed, then she spun around and kicked again. The secret guard took a hard kick, calculated exactly where she would land, and then swept her legs. There was a fierce fight here. 11 Feng folded his arms under the eaves and watched. Chang Lu sat on the stone steps with his hands flat on his legs and watched. He glanced into the room and asked quietly, "There is so much movement outside, why is there no movement inside?" Xifeng was watching intently when he saw the secret guard seizing the opportunity to grab Shijir's arm. He had a strong arm and lifted it hard. Shen Yu's feet left the ground and she was lifted up by him. Her body took advantage of the momentum and flew into the air. She flew up quickly, kicked off the tree with her feet, turned around and attacked the secret guard again. Chang Liu tugged at Xifeng's robe. "What happened at the Hakuzen hunting ground? Why did the Crown Prince and Shijir break up?" "Don't just use the word break," Xifeng said, "children don't understand the world of adults." Chang Liu let out a hum and propped up his chin to look at it for a while. Her fighting style is so messy and complicated, I can't even tell which school she comes from. It seems messy, but in fact it is well integrated. Isn't that just talking about me? Chang Liu raised his head and said proudly, Master praised me in the same way. Zai Fengsun glanced at him and struck, look at his moves, they are a combination of talent and hard work. How different from you, who is lazy every day and still does well in Qinggong. What's wrong with Qinggong? It's most useful when you're running away. Chang Liu looked at it for a while and concluded, she's not as good at Qinggong as me, and I'm not as good at anything else, so it's even, we're evenly matched. Zai Feng sneered back at him, do you have any idea? Chang Liu asked again, you said she is powerful, but why can't she win after such a long time? Brother will teach you, Zai Feng said. She kept her hand, not to win at all, but just to test. Are you testing the depth of the secret guard brother's kung fu? Zai Feng shook his head and pointed at the person in the room, she understands His Highness's attitude even if he doesn't make such a big noise. Sure enough, Shen Yu stopped her hand the next moment and did not attack again. She glanced at the door that was lit but closed, and her eyes suddenly felt a little sore. She took half a step back to the dark place under the eaves, and clasped her fists towards the secret guard. Excuse me. The secret guard cupped his fists and responded, thank you for your mercy. Shen Yu said nothing more. Chang Liu seemed to see her smile at him, but it was ugly. Then he turned around, opened the courtyard door step by step and walked out. Chang Liu stood up and clapped his hands, no chance. When he turned around, he saw that the window of the study room was open with a palm-width crack. Xie Zhou was looking back from the courtyard door, staring at the light on the table, slightly lost in thought. At dawn the next day, the secret guards welcomed Shen Yu again. This time she climbed over the wall, but did not take action directly. She just stood in the courtyard for a moment, and then said to him, I don't want to embarrass you, I will just say a few words and leave. For some reason, the look in her eyes made people feel a little lonely, and the secret guard shrank back into the shade of the tree. Shen Yu took a few steps forward and stopped at the foot of the steps. But there were 3 steps, and that was a gap she couldn't cross. She knew what he was angry about. She took matters into her own hands and started planning yesterday's situation from the moment she blamed Wen Leshan. Things went as she expected without any mistakes. The only person whose calculation was not accurate was just him. The courage on her shoulders was heavy, and the road was long and dangerous, but if all he wanted was long-term companionship, she couldn't do it. Shen Yu bent down and put down a small box. She thought about it and found that she actually had a lot to say, but she felt that words could not fully express her inner feelings. She knew clearly that she liked him and wanted him, but she couldn't force him to compromise for her. Shen Yu paused for a moment, raised her head and held back her tears. I'm sorry, I can't make daughter flowers. After saying this, she turned around. This time she walked very fast and decisively, not as slowly as last night, as if she was waiting for someone to stop her. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 155. Xie Ting's eyes fell on the door. He couldn't see her, but he could hear her footsteps, hear her putting down her things in front of the door, and hear her choking. I also heard the voice, sorry, I can't make a daughter flower. Xie Zhou didn't know how long he sat there before he opened the door. On the ground is a brocade box, and inside the box is a purse with poor stitching. It can be seen that she has embroidered very carefully, but the stitching is still very poor. In some places, she has taken it apart and re-embroidered it, and the needle holes have been stretched a bit. Xie Zhou seemed to see that dashing girl, her head hanging down under the night light, silently doing the job of being a prostitute that she was not good at. Her neck was very slender and curved beautifully under the lamp, like a moon rising in the sky. Shen Yu left the capital with the imperial edict, accompanied by 5,000 soldiers and horses. The common people don't understand. When they see the officers and soldiers, they feel that there is going to be a war again. When a war breaks out, the people will not be able to make a living. The horses' hooves stirred up dust and smoke, and Shen Yu beat the horse in front. This was Shen Yu's first time leading an army alone. After all, she would follow the same path that her father and brother took. She looked towards the hill where the two of them were buried. The morning mist lingered in the mountains, the blue sky was clear, and there was an unmistakable desolation among the floating white clouds. Suddenly there was a clear chirp of hay donking from the sky. Shen Yu looked back and saw hay donking spreading its wings in the blue sky, roaring towards him and hovering above his head, causing many soldiers to look up. "It's by you." Shen Yu laughed, "Are you here to see me off?" After she asked this question, a joy that she dared not touch suddenly arose in her heart. Shen Yu was stunned for a moment, then suddenly turned the horse's head and continued moving forward, galloping in the opposite direction. The strong wind blew against her face, and she hit the horse very fast. After running for 3 miles, her speed became slower and slower, and finally she slowly stopped. The road back was empty and uninhabited. She smiled mockingly to herself. After all, she was overthinking it and thought he would at least come to say goodbye. Shen Yu swallowed the disappointment in her throat, turned the horse's head, and returned along the road she had just walked. "When I came, I was full of joy, but when I left, I was dejected." Ta-ta-ta-ta. There seemed to be the sound of horse hooves in the distance. Shen Yu didn't dare to look back, fearing that the joy would be in vain again. Bai Yu cried out again, like a reminder. Shen Yu slowly turned back. Xieting Zhou rode her horse and whipped her whip, facing the long hunting wind, and came from the end of the ancient road. Behind her was the most beautiful spring light she had ever seen in her life. Shen Yu kept watching him getting closer and closer, when suddenly there was a weight on her body, and she was covered by his cloak. Xieting Zhou followed her in, leaned forward and grabbed her waist, lowered his head and kissed her. He chased her for 50 miles, knowing that he could catch up with her if he kept chasing her, but he was still flustered, as if he would be even more uncomfortable if he was 1 step slower. "It wasn't until I was in my arms again that I felt at ease." Shen Yu felt something was stuffed into her hand, which was slightly heavy. She wanted to see it, but Xieting Zhou held her wrist tightly and prevented her from seeing it. The cloak seemed to isolate everything from the outside world, and she could smell his breath inside. Xieting Zhou moved his lips, pressed it against her forehead, and said warmly, "The heart has a high platform, which attracts the phoenix to rest there. Auntie, you are not a daughter flower, you are the Luen bird in my heart." It turned out that he had been thinking wrong all along, and always felt that he would feel at ease only if he had her under his wings. He was angry that she always wanted to go out, and that she could never stop for him. Until last night, he suddenly realized that he could not trap her. That tenacious girl who was alone, confused, and groping along the way, could actually set up such a wonderful situation on her own. He suddenly realized that she no longer seemed to need him, and he had never felt so out of control. It was like she was about to fly, but he couldn't catch her or protect her. It was the first time he felt so powerless. He didn't know what he was angry about or panicked about. He obviously held her so tightly and treated her so well, so why did she still want to fly? Now he figured it out. How can a Luen bird hide in an eagle's feathers? He should let her fly high and fly high with her. Xieting Zhou tied Shen Yu's cloak, his eyes lingered on her face for a moment, and he said warmly, "I'll wait for you to come home in Shengjing. Come back early." Without saying anything, he lightly slapped the horse's buttocks and watched the horse take a few steps forward. Shen Yu wanted to look back at him again. "Don't look back," Xieting Zhou said, I'll watch you go and I'll pick you up when you come back. Shen Yu smiled with tears in her eyes and nodded vigorously, yes. The solemn look was very cute, and Xie Zhou laughed. The horse started walking slowly, and Shen Yu lowered her head to glance at what he had just given her. That's a knife. It was the knife that she couldn't put down, but just to coax him, she gave it back to him. He once said that the knife had no name because he hadn't thought of it yet, but now the knife has 2 words engraved on it. Yinfen. Shen Yu burst into tears. She is the Luan bird in his heart, and this knife is called Yinfen, which is meant to guide her home. She had no home, but he built one for her and told her that the phoenix should remember to return to its nest. She rode her horse slowly in the morning light, her eyes steady through tears. Gradually, the sound of horse hooves became thicker and faster. Snapped. His beloved girl galloped away, whipping up her horse and whip. Xie Zhou stood on the hill on horseback. The figure had long since disappeared, but he was still looking at it from a distance. Shengjing Changfeng is still the same, but after all, that person is missing. End of the previous volume. All the way south, we walked for about 20 days. It rains a lot in the south in April, and the official road is muddy. Especially after entering Kikame Mansion, the road in the next few days will be even more difficult. Kikame Mansion is very poor. It should be said that this area is very poor, including neighboring Luzhu. It was getting late, and the army was encamped 30 miles away from Sandpiper Mountain. My lord, Kikame's his who sent someone to deliver a letter. Send it up. Xiao Chuan handed the letter to her. He was the deputy general sent by the Ministry of War to accompany him. He was from the Xiao family, but he did not join the Xiao family army and instead served in the capital. I originally had some objections to Shizhi leading his troops, and he did a lot of embarrassing things along the way. Shen Yu didn't talk much to him. She just said that you don't like me. Let's compete. If I lose, you will be the middleman. If you lose, don't talk to me. After that fight, Xiao Chuan was completely subdued by him. After Shen Yu read the letter, Xiao Chuan asked, do you want to reply? No need. Shen Yu threw the letter away. Kikame Magistrate Lu Songlin invited me to the city for a banquet, so don't pay attention. Shen Yu had already spread out the map by herself, folding her arms and saying nothing. Xiao Chuan said, Sir, are you going to rest for a day before attacking, or are you going to strike while the iron is hot? Today is the 8th day of April, right? Xiao Chuan was stunned for a moment when he was asked, yes. Wait a few more days. Shen Yu said, we have to wait for one more person. Who? Shen Yu gave up and said, the key person might be able to save us a lot of trouble. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 156. Kikame is located in the southwest, and the humidity is a bit heavy at night. Shen Yu lay on a simple camp bed, unable to sleep with Xie Zhou's cloak on her pillow. She felt that she was a little obsessed with the smell of Xie Zhou. She had been sleeping like this for nearly a month since she left Beijing. The cloak was with her every night as a pillow or in her arms. The smell of Xie Zhou had long since dissipated, but she could smell it without using her nose. Be careful. Shen Yu lay down for a while, got up from the bed, lit the lamp again, and put pen and paper on the table. When I picked up the pen, I didn't know what to write. Did I miss him? Are you saying you're not used to him not being around? That's a bit gross. Shen Yu was not satisfied with the first letter, so Shen Yu tore up a piece and put it on paper again. This was the second letter she had written to him since leaving Beijing. In April, the garden is full of begonia flowers. Xieting Zhou read her letter under the lamp. Stop the boat. Xieting Zhou stared at those two words over and over again, as if he could see her calling him in those two words he was most familiar with. She always either calls him His Highness, or calls her Xieting Zhou when she is unhappy. Xieting Zhou took a sip of tea and continued to read the letter. All the way south, today is March 25th. I led my troops to Qingzhou. The trip was uneventful. I had some disagreements with the Lieutenant General, but they have been resolved now. The people in Qingzhou are suffering so much. Many people starved to death last winter. The fields are even more shocking. Starving people are everywhere, and abandoned children can be seen everywhere. In the face of a huge disaster, I realized how insignificant their resistance was, and how little I could do. You say it's strange or not, but I often dream about my father, but I have never dreamed about my brother. Dad always says in his dreams that I can save more people, but I don't know what else I can do or how I can save more people. Tonight, I dreamed of my father again. When I woke up, I couldn't fall asleep, so I put on my clothes and got up to write this book. Also, I hope you come to sleep. Ayu. Xieting Zhou held tea in his mouth and read her words several times in his thoughts. The road was long and the letters were slow. The letters on the road in March did not reach his hands until April, when the azaleas were blooming all over the fields. All in all, she should have arrived in Kikane by now. Xieting Zhou spread out the paper and picked up the pen to write. Auntie, my wife, seeing each other is like seeing her face to face. He imagined her reaction when she saw the word my wife. She would hold the letter and pace back and forth, complaining annoyingly and coquettishly, we haven't even gotten married yet, so how can we call her my wife? But since he gave away the phoenix, he has regarded her as his only wife in this life. Everything is well in the capital. De Wang misses you and can't eat. I took De Wang to Qingpiju. His temperament is quite like yours. He was afraid of Kang at first, but now he has been able to ride on Kang's head in only 20 days. Xieting Zhou paused, remembering the bloody figure from the back when they first met, and then her pulling up her sleeves and calling him daddy, and then her kneeling in the tent and saying that this life was his. Now she is also riding on his head. He continued to write. Fueyao has been released from prison. I went to the Jiaofang department twice during this period. Chang Liu used this to threaten to tell you, just to get another pink tank for his turtle, so I sent him to the army. Train with soldiers. Rather than being instigated, I should confess on my own that I went to the Jiaofang office for official business, but I was not drunk and did not touch anyone. In fact, I did not even look at it, so my wife can rest assured. The pomegranate flowers in the other village are about to bloom. I also miss you and can't eat, and look forward to returning soon. Every word is about trivial matters at home, but every word is about lovesickness. Her letter was full of worries, but his reply to her was full of joy. He only hoped that she could get a moment of comfort and smell a little bit of home during the march. After staying at the foot of the Sandpiper Mountain for 3 days, the person Shen Yu was waiting for finally arrived. The person who came was a man in his mid-30s, with a strong back and strong waist. His lower body was extremely stable and his martial arts was not weak. The rest of the people were cleared out of the tent, leaving only Shen Yu and the visitor. Uncle Shen Yu said hello with a smile. Kishan immediately knelt down on one knee and wanted to call out Miss, but was unable to do so because he was in the military. Shen Yu raised his arm and stood up, no need to be polite, just call me Shijir or Sir in the military. Qi Shan is the family member of the ghost who fell into the trap of being a bandit in Zhouzhe Mountain. He was dissatisfied with the decision made by his father, and the father and son separated. He wandered all the way, and finally found a job as a nurse in the Lu family in Hezhu, under the pseudonym Qi Shan. The Lu family treated him well. He settled down in Hezhu and married a wife. Their son is now 3 years old. Shen Yu received his guidance on basic skills when she was young, so she called him Uncle Shan. Is my grandmother okay? Shen Yu asked. Okay, my body is still strong, Qi Shan said with a smile as he opened the bag. The old lady asked me to bring you the letter along the way. Shen Yu took the letter and hurriedly opened it. After reading it carefully, a smile appeared on her face. Grandma said that she had received something from King Balin, and she had also sent a gift in return, which was already on her way. Shen Yu put away the letter and said seriously, you must also know the purpose of this trip. The expression on Kishan's face suddenly became solemn. I guess I know that. I have always heard that Beijing will send troops to suppress bandits when I was in Hezhu. I didn't expect that you would be the one to lead the troops in the end. Shen Yu said, the reason here is very complicated. I won't explain it to you. The court wants me to suppress the bandits, but I want to give them a chance. Kishan thought for a while and said, do you want me to persuade you to surrender? There is no need for you to persuade me to surrender. Shen Yu looked at him and said, I want you to go into the mountain tomorrow and have your father come down to see me. Qi Shanwei said, my father is stubborn by nature. When I left home, he told me to leave and never come back. Over the years, I have never replied to the letters I wrote, and all the things I sent were returned. He said with some sadness, it may not be useful if I try to persuade you, but I will try my best. Shen Yu stuffed the letter into her sleeve. He will come, because he is desperate. You only need to tell him that the few people who entered Beijing are gone and I am his last chance. Qi Shan raised his head and wanted to ask, but felt that this was not something he should be involved in. He nodded and said, I will leave early tomorrow morning. Shen Yu said, tomorrow at noon, we will be 10 miles east of Sandpiper Mountain. If I don't lead an army, he will have to come alone. If not, I will lead an army into the mountain the day after tomorrow. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 157. The bandits in Sandy Mountain in Kikane Prefecture are not well known. They are not independent on the mountain like Taidong 36 village. They are considered to be half a martial arts sect, and their scale can compete with the state government's yamen. Perhaps this is also the reason why they have been peacefully together all these years. Qi Shan went up the mountain along the familiar mountain road. After nearly 20 years, he finally returned here. He was still a teenager when he left home, but he was nearly 40 years old when he returned. Perhaps he was timid about being close to home, so when he reached the halfway point of the mountain, Qi Shan stopped and looked at the top of the mountain. Susu. A small sound, like the treetops being blown by the wind. Kishan's eyes suddenly moved. There was an ambush. His right foot drew a half arc on the ground, which was the starting point of Goijia's 3 unique kicks. The leader in the forest raised his hand to stop the others from taking action. He stared at Kishan's face for a moment and suddenly shouted, it's a ghost mountain. Qi Shan sat in the village, and several children at the door poked their heads and looked curiously. It's all rough tea. Goi came in with the tea, put it on the table, and said rudely, you are used to living in Luzjinwawo. I'm afraid you are not used to a place like ours. Qi Shan refused to accept his harsh words and asked, where is Dad? Goi raised one foot and put it on the chair, shout, it's his business whether he comes to see you or not. Qi Shan glanced at the sky and became a little anxious, I must see Dad today. Tell me first what you are here for, Goi said, you have also seen that the gang of bandit suppressors have already arrived. They may attack at some time. Why are you unwilling to join us in the past, but now you are willing to do so, come to live and die together? Kishan said, I don't have time to argue with you. I'm here to save people. If it's too late, I really won't have a chance. You, Goi looked him up and down, it seems that you are doing very well outside. Have you mastered some extraordinary magical skills that can give you 1 for 10,000? Goi Qi Shan scolded angrily, the person you came to Beijing to complain to is already dead. If you don't call Dad out, we will all die here tomorrow. Gui Si stood up from the chair and said, "What did you say? How do you know?" His eyes moved, "Just wait." After that, he strode away. The sun gradually rose above the head. 10 miles east of Sandpiper Mountain, under a lonely roadside tree, Shen Yu sat on a chair under the shade of the tree, drinking tea leisurely. There were only 2 people behind her, the guards assigned to her by Xieting Zhou. Originally planning to come alone, the 2 guards refused to let him go and could only say one sentence, "His Highness has given orders. This place is a flat land and there can be no ambush around it." This is why Shen Yu chose this place. If she had already won 5 points in the battle of leading troops to Kikane, then she was 8 points sure of the victory in Kishan Mountain. The sound of horse hooves was getting closer and closer, but Shen Yu did not get up. Qi Shan and his father Gui Xiong galloped towards him and dismounted. Kishan was informed by Shen Yu, but she did not reveal her true identity, only that she was originally from Shenzhongan's army. Gai Xiong looked around and asked straight to the point, "You said you could save us, how?" Shen Yu asked back, "Where is the food and grass?" Gai Xiong is nearly 60 years old, with gray hair on his temples, but a tall figure and a straight back. He looked at the boy in front of him warily. He looked like he was no more than a teenager, but his actions and words were calm and steady, making people sigh that a hero is born out of a boy. Gui Xiong sneered, "Where did you get the food and grass?" Shen Yu looked at him coldly. There was a fierce battle at Yanliang Pass, food and grass were delayed in arriving, and they were robbed at Sandpiper Mountain. This is known to the whole world. What you know is not necessarily the truth, Gui Xiong said righteously. If you haven't taken something, you haven't taken it. No matter how you ask, you haven't taken it. The more Gai Xiong talked, the more angry he became. Although I, Gai Xiong, was unlucky enough to be a bandit, I am not so mad as to be a soldier fighting on the front lines while I am stealing food from the rear. If you are calling me here today to humiliate me, then I will go back to the mountain waiting for you to suppress the bandits. After saying this, he turned to leave. I believe you, Shen Yu put down the teacup, but you have to tell me, if there is no food and grass, where did the food and grass go? The baggage team entered Kikane and lost it at Sandy Mountain. There is no food at all, Gui Xiong said angrily. The southwest granary has been empty for a long time, and all the people entering Kikane are empty carts weighed down by big rocks. Shen Yu's eyes suddenly shrank. She stood up from the chair, and asked in a trembling voice, "No food?" "No," Gai Xiong said firmly. Shen Yu's legs softened and she took a step back. "There is no food and grass, how can there be no food and grass? Therefore, when setting off from the main army, it means that there is no reserve baggage at all for this battle." She suddenly remembered what Ji Liangji said to her in prison, "Perhaps your direction was wrong from the beginning? Maybe the reason for killing Shenzhongan in the first place was not something else, but someone who wanted to save his life." Gui Xiong slowly repeated the sentence, "There is no food at all. The southwest granary has been empty for a long time. Corrupt officials have taken it and resold it. In the beginning, the grain in the granary began to get moldy, and the humidity in the southwest was heavy. This was an unavoidable thing. I reported it to the authorities, but the superiors did not pursue it. The people below discovered the way and began to transport it out in small batches for reselling. This happened every year. So." Gai Xiong sighed and squatted down on the ground. "Dad," Qi Shan shouted. Gai Xiong waved his hand and continued, "It was reselling in small batches at first, but then I became more and more courageous, and the granary was emptied just like that." Shen Yu said nothing. Along the way, she could see the devastation of Dazhu, but she didn't expect that it had reached such an extent. "You want to know why I know it so well, right?" Gai Xiong raised his head and smiled, his dark face full of wrinkles. Because. His voice began to tremble as he spoke, because I am guilty too. Shen Yu suddenly looked at him. Gui Xiong's face was covered with tears. We helped transport the grain they transported to various places and handed it over to Kui's shop for resale. At first we didn't know what was being transported. I only knew that transporting these items would allow people in the mountains to eat. Later I found out, it's too late, I can't get off this pirate ship. Those people are standing too high, including the minister of Hubu, the magistrate of Kikane, and the prince. What can I fight with them? I supported more than 500 people on the mountain by collaborating with them. Now there are 1,326 people on the mountain. They have all drank the blood of common people and soldiers, but we just want to survive. Gai Xiang's eyes were red. I am guilty, but the old, weak, women and children on the mountain, and those who have not participated in this matter are not guilty. If you want this old life, take it. Please, sir, spare the old, weak, women and children on my mountain. Gai Xiang knelt on his knees and hit his forehead heavily on the barren land. Shen Yu looked at the floating clouds on the horizon. She felt like a fallen leaf caught in the vortex of fate, floating and sinking, but getting further and further away from the shore. The world is so miserable. She has reached this point with the word toughness, but what is good and what is evil? She couldn't tell the difference. A long time passed, but it seemed like only a moment passed. Shen Yu spoke slowly, I don't want your life, I want you to come to Beijing with me. What to do? Go and peel off the last layer of this troubled world. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi. Chapter 158. Shen Yu took Gui Xiong back to the station, but how to arrange it became a problem. Just as she was thinking about it, Xiao Chuan asked for a meeting outside the tent. Shen Yu thought for a moment and said, come in. Xiao Chuan opened the curtain and entered the tent. Shen Yu was not the only one in the tent, but there were also 2 guards, as well as Gui Xiong and his son. Xiao Chuan's eyes only stayed on Gui Xiong and his son for a moment, and he said to Shen Yu, this subordinate is at fault. What's wrong? Shen Yu sat behind the case and looked at Xiao Chuan. Xiao Chuan knelt down on one knee and said, my subordinate disobeyed your excellency's orders and was worried about his majesty's safety, so I followed him 10 miles southwest of Sandpiper Mountain without authorization. There was silence in the tent. Shen Yu looked at Xiao Chuan, not because she was worried about her safety, but because she didn't trust her as a talent. Xiao Chuan lowered his head and said nothing. Shen Yu looked at him for a long time and suddenly praised, you are very good at hiding your breath. The place was surrounded by flat dams, making it difficult to hide, but neither she nor the guards noticed him. Xiao Chuan said, my subordinate used to be a scout in the Xiao family army. No wonder Shen Yu nodded slightly, but instead of going to Chaihe to go to the front line, you went to Beijing to take charge of the mission. Why is that? Scouts have excellent hearing and vision, and they also need to go deep behind enemy lines to collect intelligence. They have skills such as concealment, escape, and disguise. It is very rare to cultivate an excellent scout. Xiao Chuan was silent for a long time before he raised his head and said, I committed a crime in the military a few years ago. What's up? I once let 2 non-Japanese go. After Xiao Chuan finished speaking, he quickly raised his head and said, it's 2 women and children. I really can't bear it. Military discipline is military discipline. No matter who is let go, he can be dealt with as he should. The Xiao family has been merciful. No wonder he has been placed in the capital these years and has only been a 7th-grade deputy commander of the 5 cities' troops. Are you worried about how to arrange them? Shen Yu was not surprised. Since he chased and overheard, he should have a rough idea of what was going on. Xiao Chuan continued, I know that you don't trust me, which is normal, but I have something to say. I, the Xiao family army, also worked hard with my head tied to my waistband. The most annoying thing is the party disputes in the court. Those civil servants fight against each other. Go and treat me as a victim. Xiao Chuan spoke so indignantly that he didn't even notice that he had brought some of his usual colloquialisms. Shen Yu has been in the army for so many years and has long been accustomed to hearing, "Get up, sit down and say." Xiao Chuan stood up and said, "I just thought about it, our trip is going to be very bad." "What do you mean?" Shen Yu's eyes narrowed. Xiao Chuan de Ma Jin Dao sat down and said, "Those who stole food must not have expected that the Zihu people would suddenly attack. They did this because they had no food. They framed it on the bandits. After the suppression, they all thought it was a fat man. In fact, it was a bad job." Quagmire. He made a slight move, and Shen Yu suddenly understood, if the suppression of the bandits is successful but the things cannot be recovered, they can charge me with enriching their own pockets. With such a large batch of grain and grass, who would believe that nothing was captured? Shen Yu thought about it, so it seemed that the minister of the Ministry of War might not be one of them, but the person the other party wanted to win over. When Leshan succeeded in suppressing the bandits, and they had the handle in their hands, so they could use a series of tricks. Xiao Chuan nodded and said, "In this case, their people may have been mixed into the army." "It's not a possibility, but a certainty," Shen Yu said. "So this is what she is worried about how to arrange the ghost family. She wanted to take back all the key criminals involved in transporting food in the cottage. Xie Ting's trick of bringing key criminals to Beijing to change the situation was no longer feasible. The other party had suffered such a huge setback. How could he be unprepared this time? Then we can only follow the army. I have a method and I don't know if it will work," Xiao Chuan said. "Logically, the suspects should be detained separately. They have good martial arts. I suggest that they be detained together or in two groups. If they are held in a group, even if someone comes to silence them, I'm afraid it's not that easy for others to get. We just need to be careful about poisoning our food." This was the only solution. Shen Yu thought for a while and said, "Let's do this first. As soon as the remaining people arrive, I will set off back to Beijing tomorrow." "Report," the soldier outside the tent announced. "Come in." The soldier entered the tent and handed over a message. His who Kikane personally came to visit. "You came so quickly," Shen Yu sneered. "You're already here, please come in." The Gui family and his son avoided the situation, and his who was invited by the soldiers to enter the account. Shen Yu was served tea and said straight to the point, "Master's his who lives in the 5th rank, so he should be a lower official to pay a visit." Lu Songlin smiled and said, "Master, she was appointed by His Majesty. He holds an important position and cannot leave easily. It doesn't matter whoever takes a trip." Seeing Shi Yu but smiling without saying a word, Lu Songlin asked, "I saw that Mr. Shi has been staying here for 4 days but has yet to go up the mountain to suppress the bandits, so I came to ask if there are any difficulties or where we need help from our yamen." To put it mildly, it was just to urge her to silence her as soon as possible. Shen Yu said, "That's not true. To be honest, I have recruited the bandits on the Sandpiper Mountain and am preparing to return to the capital tomorrow to report to the emperor." Xiao Chuan, who was standing aside, glanced at Shen Yu and hesitated to speak. "Why is this?" Lu Songlin was shocked. "Master, she didn't know that the bandits on the Sandpiper Mountain are so rampant. They usually burn, kill, and loot within the territory, and they don't even let go of the food and grass allocated to the front line. Now those who are so heartbroken should be strangled on the spot. I heard that Mr. Shi came from General Shen's army, so he should be able to understand my indignation." Shen Yu smiled softly and said, "Mr. Liu's information is so well informed." A trace of embarrassment flashed across Lu Songlin's face. He took a sip of tea and said, "I'm just worried about people's livelihood. What I should do depends on your wishes. Shen Yu lowered her eyes and glanced at his waist. She did not answer his words, but leaned forward. Mr. Liu, this piece of white jade is very good. With the current salary of a low-ranking official, I can save enough to retire and return to my hometown. I don't know, can you save enough? Lu Songlin's expression changed. He reached out and pulled off the jade pendant, and said with a smile, it's just a fake. If you like it, take it. Shen Yu refused. I can't bear it. Our military attachés are wielding swords and guns. It would be a pity if they broke. The smile on Lu Songlin's face grew wider. He clapped his hands, and a boy came in. Lu Songlin took a wooden box and put it on the table, tapping his fingers on it. Kikang's specialties. If you want to go back to Beijing, how can you not bring some specialties with you? This thing is not easy to break. Shen Yu opened the box and took a look. There was a thick stack of silver notes, all with denominations of 1,000 taels. It looked like there should be as many as 10,000 taels. She was now a 6th grade lieutenant general, and her annual salary was only 60 taels of silver. Shen Yu gave Lu Songlin a knowing smile and closed the box. After seeing off Lu Songlin and returning, Xiao Chuan was still in the tent, looking at Shen Yu with an indignant look on his face. How can my lord? Shen Yu glanced at him and said, if you have anything to say, just say it. Xiao Chuan suppressed his anger and said, my lord told him our itinerary and took his money. Are you ready to stand on their side? Shen Yu glanced at Xiao Chuan's hand on the knife. It seemed that as long as she said yes, he was ready to kill her on the spot. I advise you not to take action. You are no match for me, Shen Yu said casually. Xiao Chuan pressed the knife and said in a deep voice, I don't want to give it a try. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 160. Li Jifeng turned around and saw Xieting Zhou standing not far behind him. He didn't know if he heard what he just said. Xieting Zhou stood with his backlight, his face hidden in the gloom, and Li Jifeng felt as if those eyes had seen through him. When did you come? Just arrived, Xieting Zhou said. It's getting late, I'm going back too. Perhaps because of the little episode just now, Li Jifeng didn't leave him alone. He watched the carriage disappear at the end of the long street before returning to Ziwiun Tower. Xieting Zhou returned to the palace. 11 Feng stayed at the door for a moment and then followed him. The concierge at the east gate said that a man named Sanfu came to see Shizhi. After waiting at the east gate for a while, he said he would wait at the main gate, but he said he didn't see anyone at the main gate. Go find it, Xieting Zhou said. 11 Feng said, I have sent people to look along the road, but there is no one. Maybe the guy is too lazy to wait to go back. I will send people to the inn and his home to ask. Not long after, the people who were sent had already gone back and forth. Sanfu's family said that he had not returned home since he left in the morning, thinking that he was still at the inn. The waiter at the inn said that he left before dark, thinking that he had gone home, but neither party saw anyone. It must be important for Sanfu to come to Xiu, and the important things he can come into contact with are nothing more than those related to the ghost family members of Chichenglei who stayed at the inn before. In the early morning of the next day, 11 Feng returned home covered with frost and dew. He took people out to search for Sanfu last night but could not find it. There was no news until this morning. Have you found someone? Xieting Zhou drank some wine last night and got up a little late today. Found it, Zifeng said seriously, dead. Xieting Zhou waved his hand, and the two maids who were changing clothes withdrew. 11 Feng said, the boatman on the boat on the Tai River got up in the morning and found a corpse. He reported it to the official. Sixi has already gone to identify the body. It is Sanfu. The cause of death was drowning. The Tai River is so far away from the palace, why would Sanfu go all the way to jump into the river? What should we do? Xie Zhou said calmly, it is no longer safe for Sixi and his family. Send someone to send his family to another village. 11 Feng agreed. In the past, His Highness would never have cared about their life or death in such a matter. The old prince once said that the prince is good in everything, but he is a little cold-hearted. Shiger has a soft heart, Zifeng said. Xie whose lips curled up, slightly proud, she has seen everything in the world, but she can't see the suffering in the world. He changed the subject and said, she should be back in 3 days. Of course Zifeng knew who it was and said, Your Highness, are you going to pick someone up? No, Xie Zhou walked around the screen, she is escorting the prisoner back to Beijing this time. The Ministry of Punishments will contact her and send someone out of the city to pick up the prisoner. As if to convince himself, he added, it's not convenient for me to go. Shen Yu escorted a total of 14 key criminals on her trip back to Beijing, all of whom were bandits involved in transporting food for corrupt officials in Sandy Mountain. The night is as thick as ink, and there are still 60 miles away from Beijing. Tomorrow, people from the criminal department will greet them at the first post house 30 miles outside Shengjing. It's the last night, so cheer up. Xiao Chuan arranged the night watch, sat down by the fire, and backed away in panic due to the heat. It's May and it's not cold at night. I didn't expect this trip to go so smoothly, Xiao Chuan said. The firelight made Shen Yu's pupils turn red. The journey was so smooth that she actually felt there was something wrong. Don't you think it's a little too smooth? Xiao Chuan said, isn't this your credit? By pretending to surrender, they will think that we are on their side, and naturally they will relax their vigilance. Something's wrong. Shen Yu shook her head and said, it's just tonight. Let's see if they will take action tonight. Shen Yu stood up from the fire, walked to the prison car, and said to Qi Shan, I will go to Beijing tomorrow and you will leave early tomorrow morning. Qi Shan stood guard next to Gui Xiong's prison car. He left home early and was not involved in the grain transportation case, so he did not need to be accompanied to Beijing. But he couldn't let go of his old father. This case was too big, and maybe this meeting would mean goodbye forever. I want to stay in Beijing for a few more days, Kishan said. You won't make any difference if you stay in the capital. Shen Yu knew what Qi Shan wanted to do, and she just wanted to wait and see how the verdict would be decided. Let's go, Gui Xiong suddenly said, it's best to leave tonight. Don't be an eyesore in front of me. You just left when you were a teenager. What are you doing here now? Qi Shan leaned against the prison car and his eyes turned red. Father, please don't provoke me. I know you are afraid that I will be implicated. Your son is unfilial. He left home early and was not around to respect him. It's okay to follow you on the road to respect him. That's nonsense, Gui Xiong scolded. I didn't expect that you have lived for more than 30 years and still do whatever you want. What will happen to your eldest daughter and Hubba if you die? Kishan was stunned, his eyes moved a few times, and he suddenly laughed with relief. You don't accept the things I send every year, and you don't accept the letters I send, either, because you are afraid of hurting me. Gui Xiong said, I don't like him. Qi Shan choked up and said, then how do you know the nicknames of Dainio and Huahua? Gai Xiong didn't answer and looked away. During the Chinese New Year the year before last, the girl said that she met a grandpa outside the yard. Grandpa asked her how her family was doing, chatted with her for a long time, and even gave her candy. Is that you? I should have guessed it earlier, Kishan said to himself with tears streaming down his face. What are you doing outside during the Chinese New Year? Who will accompany you to the New Year's Eve dinner? Shen Yu thought of Shen's Hongan, and her eyes felt sore. She stepped back silently, leaving time for their father and son. Gui Xiong finally spoke, I'm passing by with food, isn't it? Dad, Qi Shan turned around and knelt on the ground, holding onto the prison car with both hands. My son is unfilial. Gai Xiang stared at Kishan, as if he wanted to remember his son's appearance in his heart, but as he looked at it, his eyes became blurry. He raised his head and looked up at the night sky, choking and saying, Shan'er, you're walking well. If you didn't walk, our family would be dead. The tiger baby is about 3 years old. When he gets older, you can teach him the 3 unique kicks. Kishan stretched out his hand and wanted to hold his old father's hand, but he couldn't reach it. The hands stretched out stubbornly, and finally, the shackles jingled, and Gui Xiang held his hand. Don't mention my grandfather to the big girl Hua. Grandpa took the wrong road and can't go back. I should take the next road. After a peaceful night, the morning breeze swept over the hills, and the army continued on its way. Qi Shan watched the team go away. He couldn't even tell where the prison van was, but he seemed to be able to see his father's eyes, looking at him from a distance and reluctant to move away, as if he wanted to see him clearly. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 162. Shen Yu was lying low, but she didn't make any mistake. Emperor Tongxue asked coldly, Shiger, do you know your guilt? Shen Yu lowered her eyes and said, Your Majesty speaks freely, I don't know what the crime is. There was silence in Hanshang Hall, and Defu quickly followed suit and knelt down. After a while, Emperor Tongxue's old laughter suddenly sounded in the palace. I didn't expect it. I really didn't expect it. Emperor Tongxue laughed so much that he coughed twice. He took a breath and continued, the person who knows me best is a teenager like you. Emperor Tongxue laughed again, smiling, and the smile on his face was gradually covered with depression. What you have said is nothing more than a reminder to me that it is time to make a decision. You're right. Emperor Tongxue waved his hand for her to stand up, and said, I am more than successful but not enough to start a business. I have been guarding this country for 18 years. This is the 19th year. It is time to win. It's a win. He took over this rotten court and guarded it for 18 years. He never thought about opening it to take a look. He didn't dare. He was afraid that if he opened it, it would cause turmoil. He was afraid that the kingdom of Zhou would be ruined in his own hands and let the country be destroyed. He became a sinner for the ages. How can a dying man be content if he doesn't watch the decay being uncovered and stripped away? Shen Yu walked out of Hanshang Hall and looked up at the sky. The dark clouds seemed to be about to be torn away, and her steps became brisk. Now she just wants to see Xieting Zhou as soon as possible and tell him the good news. Lord Shi, please stay. Defu and 2 eunuchs hurriedly chased him, and finally intercepted Shiger before he left the palace. Defu was approaching, holding a bright yellow imperial edict. Master Shi, please accept the edict. Shen Yu bowed down. Telford read out the imperial edict aloud. According to the emperor's edict, Zhonglang General Xiu has made great achievements in suppressing the bandits, and he has been promoted to the rank of Yuhao in front of the 5th rank palace. Shen Yu was stunned. After declaring the imperial edict, Defu immediately helped Shen Yu stand up with a smile. Congratulations to Sir Shi. I have offended Sir Shi a lot in the palace just now. I hope you will forgive me. Shen Yu forced a smile and felt restless while holding the imperial edict. She jumped several levels in 2 months. With such a promotion speed, except for Zhang Lianzi, she was probably the first person in the Great Zhou dynasty, but she couldn't laugh. The imperial guards of the imperial palace belong to the palace front division and accompany the emperor. For such an important position, the emperor usually only uses people he trusts, which is equivalent to handing over his wealth and life. What is the purpose of Emperor Tongxue using a newcomer like her? Defu returned to Hanshang Hall. Emperor Tongxue was holding his sick body to review the votes submitted by the cabinet. When he saw him entering the palace, he asked without raising his head, "Is it done?" "It's done." Defoe beamed with joy. "How did she react?" Defoe thought for a moment and said, "Master, she seems to be very confused and doesn't show much surprise." "That's right," Emperor Tongsu said. Defoe said, "Master, she is now with Prince Balin. It is difficult to distinguish between ourselves and the enemy. This servant is stupid. I don't know what your Majesty's intention is in making such an arrangement." Emperor Tongsu happened to be tired, so he put down his pen, leaned on the dragon chair, and said slowly, "That's Shenzhongan's daughter." Defoe was startled, glanced at Emperor Tongsu, and did not dare to answer. Of Shenzhongan's two daughters, one died on the battlefield and the other was in the boudoir. But Shijer didn't look like the one in the boudoir. Could it be that he was the one who died? She thought I was blind and didn't know, but she didn't know how many times her father mentioned her in front of me. Emperor Tongsu seemed to be lost in memories. "I have seen her before. I have always wanted to see what the daughter Shenzhongan was so proud of. So I have actually seen her a long time ago. I recognized her at the first sight in Beishan." Defoe didn't expect that there would be such a thing, let alone that such a young man would be born as a girl. But when you think about it, it's not so difficult to understand that she is Shenzhongan's daughter. "But your Majesty," Defoe said cautiously, "your Majesty's safety is closely related to your Majesty's safety. Such a heavy responsibility falls on Master Shi. She also has a close relationship with Prince Balin. Is there something? Are you trying to say that this is too risky for me?" "Slave doesn't dare." Emperor Tongsu said, "I believe that the daughter taught by Zhongan is different. If I am not mistaken, I have left a useful person for the court. If I am mistaken, it will be an opportunity to eliminate Balin." Defoe broke into a cold sweat when he heard this. "Your Majesty, isn't this putting your own life at risk? If you don't enter the tiger's den, you won't catch the tiger's cubs." Emperor Tongsu murmured, "I will die after exhausting myself. I don't have much time left." There was a carriage parked outside Chengtian Gate, with a young man sitting on the shaft, holding a piece of grass in his mouth and looking in the direction of the palace gate. After a while, the young man's eyes lit up and he turned around and said, "Your Highness, Shijer is out." Xie Tingzhou came out of the carriage and saw Shen Yu walking out of Chengtian Gate. Several soldiers immediately surrounded her. After a few casual conversations, she looked in the direction of Xie Tingzhou, but had no intention of coming over. Xie Tingzhou stood with his sleeves down and asked in a loud voice, "We've been gone for nearly 2 months, and we don't know each other anymore." "I don't know him." Shen Yu came closer and said, "I don't know if it's the same person who was talking to me before leaving." Xie Tingzhou suddenly laughed and said, "It sounds like the resentment is a bit heavy." Shen Yu pursed her lips. She wanted to say that she didn't know who told her to wait until she came back to pick her up, but if she said it out loud, it would seem a bit stingy. "Xie Tingzhou, you blame me for not picking you up." Shen Yu took a breath, but before she could open her mouth, Chang Lu started talking. "We're gone. We were watching you enter the city from the top of the mountain, and we've been waiting here since then." Xie Tingzhou smiled but said nothing, thinking that her awkward look was very cute. Shen Yu looked away and looked at Chang Liu. "You've tanned a lot." Chang Liu suddenly burst into tears. "He likes fair skin," Xie Tingzhou said, "he talks about it all day long. One white skin covers all ugliness." Xiao Chuan and several soldiers were at the palace gate. After watching for a long time, a soldier secretly asked, "Commander Xiao, why do I see that Sir Shi is a bit, his?" The soldier had never read a book, so he scratched his head for a long time and couldn't think of any words to describe it. "Coquettish, shy." Xiao Chuan said 2 words expressionlessly. "Yes. Yes," the soldier said excitedly, "you are just shy. Look, the prince even supported Mr. Shi's waist. With his kung fu, Mr. Shi can jump 10 feet high." He doesn't need help to get into the carriage. Shen Yu stood on the carriage shaft and turned around to say hello to Xiao Chuan. She got in front of the carriage and threw the imperial edict in Chang Liu's hands. Xie Tingzhou had just settled down in the carriage when he heard a scream from Chang Liu, who was outside the carriage. Without even saying hello, he squeezed his head through the gap in the curtain. "Your Highness, Shizhi has been promoted." Xie Tingzhou glanced over, and Chang Liu guiltily pulled the curtain a little further, revealing only a pair of eyes. Facing Xie Tingzhou's cold gaze, Chang Liu whispered, "It's Marquis Yu, the chief minister in front of the palace." Xie Tingzhou's expression changed and he asked, "Where is the imperial edict?" "Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince author, Gigi." Chapter 163. Chang Liu handed the imperial edict in and closed the curtain tightly, covering it up tightly. The eldest son of his family seemed to be angry, and he was afraid of letting out his anger. Chang Liu waited for a moment, then heard a boom in the carriage and couldn't help but shrink his neck. Xie Tingzhou asked coldly, "Did you accept the order?" Shen Yu stood up and picked up the imperial edict that Xie Tingzhou had thrown into a corner. "Can I still resist the decree?" Xie Tingzhou tensed his jaw. He expected that Emperor Tongxiu would promote Shen Yu, but he never expected that she would be in such a position. Why did Emperor Tongxiu summon her into the palace and put her in front of him? Could it be? An idea flashed through my mind. Could it be that Emperor Tongxiu already knew about the relationship between the two and was using Shen Yu to contain him? Xie Tingzhou felt a warmth on the back of his hand, and lowered his eyes to see her hand covering the back of his hand. "It will be okay," Shen Yu comforted him, "even Emperor Tongxiu is not afraid of luring wolves into his house. I have nothing to be afraid of. Besides, I am also good at being in front of the Emperor. Many things cannot escape my eyes." Xie Tingzhou's brows knitted together slightly, he held her hand with his backhand and rubbed his thumb on the back of it a few times. He knew in his heart that what she said made sense. Before leaving Beijing, he said he would let her fly high, but once he encountered an unknown situation, he still felt uneasy. The palace is much more dangerous than outside. One wrong step could lead to death. "Didn't you protect me?" "They didn't dare," Shen Yu said lightly. Xie Tingzhou looked at her face and said, "If you were Balin's crown princess, they would not dare even more. Today, Balin Wangfu is very happy." Uncle Zhong, Lu Yao and others had been waiting at the door early. A banquet was held in the mansion, waiting to welcome Shen Yu after her triumphant return. Unexpectedly, as soon as he arrived, he was dragged to Qingpu residence by Xie Tingzhou. "Everyone, please take your seats," Uncle Zhong greeted everyone. Seeing their sleeves entangled together, they were so happy that they couldn't help but ask the kitchen to bring dinner to the room. They almost said it was sent to the bridal chamber. "I brought them gifts." Shen Yu followed Xie Tingzhou into the room. Xie Tingzhou closed the door with his backhand, looked down at her and asked, "Where's mine?" Shen Yu pursed her lips and smiled, "Let Xiao Chuan send it over tomorrow." "Dislike?" Shen Yu raised her eyes, "You didn't even see what I gave you, and you said you don't like it." Xie Tingzhou held the door open, circled her in front of him, and stared at her without blinking. "You have brought it back for me what I like." He stretched out his hand to touch her face and whispered, "I just lost some weight." Qingpuja became quiet, and even the guards didn't know where they were hiding. There was the sound of saliva exchanging in the room like spring silkworms eating mulberry. Xie Tingzhou kissed her, taking away her chance to breathe. A fire seemed to be lit in his chest. After 51 days of separation, he missed the person in his arms so much. Suddenly, her wrist felt cold, as if something had been wrapped around it. As soon as Shen Yu raised her hand, Xie Tingzhou grabbed it, and her fingers were intertwined. He stepped away slightly and whispered against her forehead, "Marry me, Au." Shen Yu's heart seemed to be burned with these 5 words. She saw the earnestness in his eyes and the suppressed fire in his misty eyes. There was a sudden plop under the eaves outside the house. Then came Chang Liu's angry voice, "Kick me. I will never be the best in the world with you again." Xieting Zhou closed his eyes, ignored the disturbance outside the window, stared at Shen Yu, and asked, "Marry or not? Your tone doesn't sound like you're proposing for marriage. It's like you're forcing a marriage." Shen Yu curled her lower lip. Xieting's whose nose was close to her, "Then let's consider forced marriage. You have to get married if you don't want to." The tip of his nose tilted slightly, and he tilted his head to take her lips. Shen Yu's whole body was hot, and she felt like a strong wind passing by. She was pressed by him and fell backwards, and all the strength in her body was drained away by him. She hurriedly stretched out her hand to cling to the edge of the window. The window was silently pushed open a little by her fingers, but no one noticed. Chang Liu didn't notice anything unusual. He took out the little turtle on his chest and patted it. He raised his head and said thankfully, "Fortunately." The words stopped suddenly, and he saw the scene inside the window. Xieting Zhou suddenly raised his eyes and looked over with sharp eyes like arrows. He held the back of Shen Yu's head with one hand and pressed it into his arms. Shen Yu was buried in his arms, blushing and not daring to move. Chang Liu saw His Highness the Crown Prince's hand on the window edge. The veins on the back of his hand were bulging, as if he would draw his sword and kill him here in the next moment. Your Majesty, Your Majesty." Chang Liu held the little turtle and said fearfully, I fell from above. I didn't mean to do it." Xieting's whose sharp gaze swept around the courtyard, "Everyone, get out." There was a slight sound of footsteps on the eaves, and the treetops moved slightly. The secret guards originally came and went silently, but they deliberately made noise to indicate that they had withdrawn. Chang Liu's legs were weak due to His Highness's gaze just now. He was the best in Qinggong in the whole palace, but now he couldn't even move. 11 Feng fell from the eaves, picked up Chang Liu, nodded to the prince, and walked out of the yard. Chang Liu hung on Zifeng's shoulder and said aggrievedly, "I treat you as my brother, but you kicked me. I asked you not to lie down and eavesdrop. Who knew you were so careless about kicking me?" Chang Liu was still frightened. The prince is so scary. 11 Feng put him down and patted his head. "You have to remember that the master is the master. Your Highness usually treats us generously, but there are some things that you can't touch." "What is His Highness's reverse scale?" "Zifeng, I didn't know before, but now, it should be Shiger." Xieting Zhou let go of Shen Yu, looked down at her, touched his sleeves, and the windows were completely opened. There was no one in the courtyard. The night wind was not cool at first, and Xieting Zhou had nowhere to vent his anger. He turned to the table and poured a cup of cold tea. "You scared Chang Liu," Shen Yu said. The teacup stopped at his lips. "He disturbed us." Xieting Zhou finished drinking tea. Shen Yu's face was still a little red. She lowered her head and saw the bracelet on her wrist before remembering that Xieting Zhou had just put it on her. She raised her hand and asked, "What is this?" Xieting Zhou walked towards her, hugged her from behind, held her hand and raised it. "This is something my mother left behind." Shen Yu wanted to turn her head to look at him, but Xieting's whose chin pressed against her temples. "You want to say that the beauty is bad, right?" Shen Yu looked at the bracelet on her wrist. This was something she had never touched since she was born. You can see it everywhere on the street. 1 tael of silver can buy 10 of these bracelets. Such a poor bracelet should not belong to Princess Balin. Xieting Zhou half closed his eyes. Darkness gradually emerged from his eyes. "I am not born to Princess Balin. She wishes to let me die." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, Reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 164. Speaking of which, it is the love and hatred of the older generation. He has never seen who Xieting's whose biological mother is. He once asked the old prince to draw a picture. The prince thought about it for a long time, but he only drew the back of a village girl. Xieting Zhou asked Balin King why there was only a back view. At that time, Balin King said that it had been too long and he had forgotten. His mother was just an ordinary village woman from the frontier fortress. That year, King Balin led his troops to pass by. The river was too high to cross, so they had to stay there. Just like the general and the orphan girl in the storybook, love comes so suddenly, just a glimpse, or just encountering some warmth on the road. After only 3 days together, King Balin left with his troops and promised to pick her up after he returned with his troops. But the war came so suddenly, and the war lasted for a year. When King Balin went to pick her up again, he learned that she had died in childbirth, leaving only her infant son to be raised by a neighbor. The mother, who had no wealth, could only leave her child with a bunch of her hair and an inconspicuous bracelet. Not all people can stay together forever, and not all love can be unforgettable. These few words represent that woman's life in a hurry. In just 3 short days, that woman left a lasting mark on King Balin's heart. It was so subtle that a few years later, he could no longer remember her appearance. In fact, King Balin already had a princess at that time, so King Balin took him back to raise him next to the princess. The princess had difficulty in giving birth. After 8 years of marriage, she was still childless and regarded him as her own. But everything ended when he was 4 years old. The princess is pregnant. She has a child of her own. I didn't understand at the time. The princess always asked me to give in to my younger brother. I thought it was because my younger brother was younger and my mother should love him more. Xieting Zhou fell into memories, with vague madness floating in his eyes. Balin at that time was not as peaceful as it is now. The Balin people attacked frequently, and my father often went to war. In the years that followed, I was almost always brought up by Uncle Zhou. I have practiced hard since I was a child, and I have not fallen behind in calligraphy and painting, as well as kung fu. I always thought that if I work harder and become better, my mother will like me a little bit, but every time I get nothing but perfunctory results, I wonder if it is me. Not enough. Shen Yu turned around and hugged his waist, burying her head in his chest. It's all over. She felt heartbroken. How did he come here after such a long period of time when he was a child? Feeling abandoned by his mother, how could he secretly lick his wounds? It's not over yet. Xieting Zhou tightened his hand around her waist. She finally took action. Shen Yu didn't understand and listened to him continue. He is Xie Yun. He is so dazzling that he has already fought with King Balin. He became famous in one battle at the age of 14, and the Bila people on the border were frightened by the news. When he returned, he thought he would finally get praise this time, but what he got was a strange and wary look from Princess Balin. When the princess's children grew up, she began to fear that the nominal legitimate son would take away her son's throne. She began to send snacks to Xieting Zhou every day as long as he was at home. Even if he was away on an expedition, she would make something for him to take with him on the road. She told him lovingly that the expedition was difficult and that he must take care of himself. Body. He cherished this belated maternal love very much, and sent letters home one after another. In addition to replies, each time he brought snacks made by his mother herself. I thought it was belated maternal love, but unexpectedly it turned out to be poison that penetrated the intestines. Later, he was injured in a battle, and the Bailu people quenched poison on the arrows. Only then did he discover that he had been suffering from chronic poison for a long time. Fate is sometimes so bizarre. The combination of the incurable poison and the chronic poison he had been taking all year round actually saved his life. Shen Yu closed her eyes, trembling with pain. Xieting Zhou lowered his head and kissed her temples, then stroked her back comfortingly. He raised his head and looked out the window and said, "She thought I was gentle by nature, but she didn't know that I would retaliate for my anger. There is no such thing as a gentle nature, that is the gentleness he left to his mother. How could he be willing to hold a sincere heart carefully, but what he got in the end was poison that penetrated the intestines." Seeing that he was still alive, Princess Balin thought that she had not given enough medicine, so she added a stronger dose. That was the last time that he, Princess Balin, and her son had dinner at the same table. He bet that she still had some mother-son affection for him, so he secretly exchanged the wine for her biological son under her nose. As a result, she reaped the consequences and watched her biological son vomit blood and die in front of her. It was then that I realized that she was not my biological mother. She said that I should not die a good death, that I should be alone all my life and fall into hell forever. Xietingzhou stared at her quietly. Is she right? Of course not. Shen Yu looked up at him. Now that you have me, you won't be alone all your life. We will live for many, many years and have several children, and we will be buried together after death. Xietingzhou curled her lips, and he tore open his scars without reservation. She gave him the answer he wanted, using herself to heal his childhood scars. That's a promise, he said. Shen Yu didn't react. What? Xietingzhou pinched her hand with the bracelet on it and said, "You said you wanted to have several children with me." Shen Yu blinked, then felt a little embarrassed and buried her head in his chest. "I haven't told my father yet." "Tomorrow." Xietingzhou smiled and said, "I will accompany you to see him tomorrow." Shen Yu nodded, suddenly remembered something, and broke away from his arms. "My grandmother said that King Balin sent something to Hezhu. I asked you to deliver it." Xietingzhou tilted his head and called out the window, "Prepare food." The lanterns in the courtyard were lit, and the maids filed in. Uncle Jean was very discerning. Seeing that the prince had kicked everyone out, he told the kitchen not to rush the cooking and wait until the food was passed around before cooking. Uncle Jean was standing at the entrance of the courtyard, a little disappointed. Changliu looked confused. "Grandpa, why are you sighing?" Uncle Jean said earnestly, "It's only been less than half an hour. It's not a good sign." "Why? Wouldn't it be better to eat earlier?" "You kid doesn't understand." Uncle Jean shook his head and left, and said, "Tomorrow I have to ask Dru to come and take the prince's pulse. It's really, a little too fast. I wonder if he injured his roots in the early years. I'm afraid it needs to be replenished." Treating the concubine, eliminating the wife, reborn, I refuse to marry the scumbag and marry the prince. Author, Gigi. Chapter 165. Changliu knew that he had done something wrong before and had been waiting outside the hospital to admit his mistake. After the maid finished serving the dishes, he slowly walked to the door and knelt down under the eaves. Xietingzhou was serving soup to Shen Yu. After finishing the serving, he placed it in front of Shen Yu and then glanced sideways. "What's up?" Changliu knelt straight and said, "Your Highness, I was wrong. I should not have eavesdropped on the conversation between the Crown Prince and Master Shi, nor should I have fallen off the eaves, nor should I have looked into the window." Shen Yu held the bowl and turned around silently, with her back to the door. Xietingzhou knew that she was embarrassed. "Go and kneel outside the courtyard," Xietingzhou said. "Kneel for an hour." Changliu stood up and just took 2 steps when he heard Xietingzhou ask, "Where is Uncle Jean?" "Maybe I'm going to see Dr. Yu." Changliu stopped and said, "I think I asked Dr. Yu to come tomorrow to check His Highness's pulse." "Xietingzhou, I'm not sick, what's my pulse?" Changliu scratched his head in confusion and said honestly, "I don't know either. Uncle Jean only said that less than half an hour is not a good sign. Your Highness may have injured his roots in the early years, and some of them were too fast. He needs to be repaired. Just make up for it." Shen Yu squirted out some soup and quickly wiped her mouth with a handkerchief. Xietingzhou almost broke his chopsticks and said to Changliu, Go and kneel for 2 hours. Changlia was miserable. Why? Wasn't it just an hour ago? You also said that was just now. Changlia muttered and walked away. Xietingzhou looked at Shen Yu. You seem to understand. Shen Yu pretended not to know, opened her big eyes and said innocently, what do you know? I don't understand. Then what are you spraying? Isn't it too hot? Shen Yu said confidently, you didn't know how to blow the soup for me before serving it. Xietingzhou laughed, took the bowl and blew it to cool down before placing it in front of her. He looked at her deeply and said, I will meet my father-in-law tomorrow and come back to move to Qingpu residence. This was something he had mentioned a long time ago, but it was delayed due to spring raids and bandit suppression. It's just that Shen Yu forgot to tell him something. She had just taken over the job of the palace minister, and she might have to stay in the palace all the time in the future. Moreover, with her current status as Yahao, it would be bad if she got too close to Xietingzhou. Someone would definitely make a fuss about it. I may not be able to live in the palace anymore, Shen Yu said hesitantly. Xietingzhou also thought of it. He lowered his eyes, but what he said was completely irrelevant. Is it because what I just said made you scared? Shen Yu was stunned and quickly explained, no, it's just inconvenient. Xietingzhou leaned back in his chair, his eyelids were half drooped and he looked a little disappointed. Excuse me, you are still afraid of me, because you are afraid that I might poison you one day. Seeing his lonely look, Shen Yu quickly put down the bowl and walked up to him. I'm really not afraid. Really? Xietingzhou looked up at her. Yeah, Shen Yu reached out and touched his face. I'm not afraid, I just feel sorry for you. Xietingzhou closed his eyes, tilted his head and rubbed her palm. Then how are you going to feel sorry for me? This question stumped Shen Yu. Xietingzhou held her hand and pulled her to sit on his lap. If you feel sorry for me, come back and stay with me more often. But it's inconvenient, Shen Yu said. Logically speaking, I should buy a house by myself outside. Xietingzhou thought for a while and said, buy the house, I'll let 11 Feng handle it, just to show off, you can come back and stay at night. Shen Yu thought for a while, curled her lips and said, why does it sound a bit like an affair? Xietingzhou raised his eyebrows and his eyes were seductive. Yeah, if you don't know better, you can only do it secretly. Otherwise, what should I do? Or should I go find you at night? It's getting more and more ambiguous the more I talk about it. Shen Yu pushed his chest and said, we'll see then. Xietingzhou held her in his arms. When you enter the palace, I won't be able to hug you, so I'll just eat like this. How do you eat this? Shall I feed you? Don't want. Xietingzhou finally let her down. The two sat across from each other to eat, and Shen Yu told the news she had received from Qi Chang. I was worried that the letter would be lost on the way, so I just said it went well and did not mention getting the evidence, but Xietingzhou had already guessed it. Shen Yu said solemnly, the journey back to Beijing was so smooth. It went so smoothly. It went so well that it seemed like someone was deliberately waiting for them to enter Beijing. Xietingzhou took up her words. Shen Yu nodded and said, I thought they would take action last night, but they didn't. Xietingzhou was puzzled. I've been to the Jiaofang department several times, but Fuying doesn't have the account book. Shen Yu frowned, but it stands to reason that it is safest for Ji Liangji to hand over the account book to them. If it is given to his exiled son, no one will know if he dies on the road. You also said it was them. You mean Fu Yao? Shen Yu glanced sideways. Her temperament seems unreliable. Xietingzhou said, if you think so, then Ji Liangji didn't pick the wrong person. Shen Yu was awakened by Xietingzhou. The more unreliable a person seemed, the less likely he was to arouse suspicion. It seemed that she had to find an opportunity to go to the Jiaofang division. Today I have reported the matter of grain and grass to Emperor Tongxiu. He has ordered a strict investigation. I was worried that he would take it lightly, so I only handed over half of the evidence and kept half of the account book. Emperor Tongxue is still too indecisive, Xie Tingzhou said. People tend to become soft-hearted when they are old, and he cannot be cruel to his son. Then force him to do it? Xie Tingzhou looked at her. If he is not strict this time, are you still going to incite the students of the Imperial College to force him? No. Shen Yu put down her chopsticks, her eyes flashing with light. I'll kill him. Xie Tingzhou looked at her for a long time and suddenly smiled. The crown princess is so strong. Shen Yu glanced at him and said, we must avoid suspicion from now on. You can't look at me like this. Xie Tingzhou put his elbows on the table, leaned closer, and asked quietly, what kind of look? There was bewitchment in his eyes, as if he wanted to rip her off. How come he has such a deceptive appearance? Shen Yu thought to herself. That's the look in your eyes now. Xie Tingzhou stared at her for a long time. The look in my eyes is what I want to do. Shen Yu finally understood that since he discovered her daughter's pregnancy, she could no longer use her thick skin. To deal with people like Xie Tingzhou, she had to be thicker than him. She glanced at him lightly and said, during my absence in the capital, you have been visiting the Jiaofang division. I wonder if those prostitutes have ever seen His Highness the Crown Prince look like this. The sound of His Royal Highness sounded like a warning to Xie Tingzhou. He was silent, like a snake being held by 7 inches. Come here, he raised his voice and said, get out. The maid came in, took away the leftovers from the table, and put hot tea on the table again. During this period, Shen Yu leaned on her chair and looked at him, and the two looked at each other across the busy maids. Xie Tingzhou knew that calling the maid in was just to delay time, and he had to answer the question of Jiaofang's secretary even if he didn't want to. When the maid was about to leave, Xie Tingzhou said again, prepare soup for bathing. Shen Yu turned her face away, suppressed her smile, stood up and said, since His Highness wants to take a bath, I will leave. Xie Tingzhou grabbed her hand and said, why don't we come together? The maid didn't dare to raise her eyes to look at the two of them, and even closed the door when she exited. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us. We will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding.